Hello everybody and welcome to another hobby cheating video. So this one's going to be a bit different than most of our videos, as I'm not going to cover a specific technique. Instead, since this is the weekend of Adepticon and Crystal Brush, I thought it would be fun to kind of go through how I think about competition pieces and how I prepared a specific competition piece and the techniques that I used, etc. Way back in Hobby Cheating 30, I had a video called Deliberate Practice, and I still very much believe in that method of improvement. One of the things that I frequently see people talk about when they say, I don't feel like I'm good enough, or how do I get better, and other people will simply respond, practice. And that's true, but also wrong somehow at the same time. And what I mean by that is, practice alone doesn't get you anything. There are people who will paint for years and they're theoretically practicing, but they don't improve. And the difference there is deliberate practice. To move this away from the world of miniature painting, if you think about something like a sport, if let's take this to golf, for example. If you've got a problem with your short game, your putting, and that's what's weighing you down, then you don't just practice all of golf. You go out to putting greens and you putt a lot on different greens, different angles, different distances, and you work it out. You deliberately practice one particular thing. This is true in more or less any kind of athletics or sport or, frankly, thing in life. If you think about the feedback you probably get at your job, they're telling you to deliberately practice some elements where they feel you have an opportunity for growth or improvement. It's the same with miniature painting. Just painting miniatures doesn't really do much. So I thought I would talk through the various techniques that I've have tutorials on and that I utilized on this mini you see in front of you right now. This mini is currently competing at Crystal Brush. It's available for voting, so if you want to go vote for this or any other pieces, I'll have the link down in the description. Your vote is obviously greatly appreciated, but what I really want to talk about is how I came to do this piece. So this is just some level setting. This is probably my favorite piece I've ever done. This was a project I've wanted to do for about a year. I'll talk about the inspiration behind it in a moment. This was probably about 150 hours of work, all in, to just sort of set on that. That doesn't mean anything. I'm not trying to be like, oh my goodness, I did so much work. There's people who do a lot more. I'm only pointing it out to say that, you know, when you talk about how do you get to a place, especially on something of this size, one of the answers is going to be time, and I don't have a particular hobby cheating video or tutorial on that, except to say that if you really want to make something that you truly love, eventually there's going to be a time component to that, most likely. Okay. At anywho, let's get into it. So I want to start with my inspiration for this piece. So this is one of my favorite pieces of art in all of Warhammer 40k. This is by John Blanche. This is from the Sisters of Battle cover in 1992. It is a wonderful piece of grimdark. It tells everything you need to know about the world with this bright, gleaming Sister of Battle, this cauldron, this sort of caldera of fire behind her, smoke and lightning. All of the bones, like, look at the field of the dead that they're on, and then you've got these various sort of hangers-on and religious zealots and such that are just so weird. Only Blanche creates art like this, and it's always been one of my favorite things. So as you know, last year they released the Canoness Viridian, which I ended up painting like this. This was a competition piece that I did last year. And it was obviously attempting to recreate the cover to some degree, to the point where I repainted the background by hand and so on and so forth. So I had done this piece, and I thought, I liked it, but in the end it was just an attempt to sort of recreate Blanche's work as accurately as I could on the miniature. There are some very subtle differences between this miniature that they produced and Blanche's work that I noticed in painting, but it's not really a big deal. In the end, when I did this, I really liked painting this particular model. I really love the canonists. I have a deep love for the Sisters of Battle. They are and always have been my favorite army in the world of Warhammer 40k. And so I thought, I want to take it to the next level. I want to make it bigger. So hence this piece. So this is my redemption engine. Obviously, there's the concept within the Sisters of the penitent engines, sisters who have failed and are sort of strapped into these big machines, which usually ends in their death. But I thought, what if one was successful enough, if someone was something heroic enough to redeem themselves, but had gotten used to fighting in that style, and so was given a new engine to fight in, but still restored back to her armor. Again, I don't know of this ever happening in the lore, but I didn't really care. It seemed a nice story. So I knew I wanted to do a Knight Titan for the sister to be piloting from the outside in the same method as the penitent engines, because the faith in the Emperor protects. Why would you need anything else when you have faith in the Emperor? And I knew I wanted to position the Titan the same way. I wanted the position to the Titan to be holding the sword, etc. So then it came time to actually go to the work. Now, there are things that I did here in pre-work I don't have specific videos on, but just to quickly touch on it, obviously this was not painted as one piece. Knight Titans are done in lots of sub-assemblies. The skeletal frame was separated into two parts. The arms were separate. All of the armor plates were separate. So this piece has a ton of sub-assemblies when you do it. And obviously she herself was not assembled into the miniature. I don't have any pictures of my various sub-assemblies, but I think you can get the idea. I just took, basically none of the armor was on. You had the skeleton of the knight, arms separate, and then all the various armor laid out. I like to keep the armor on like a piece of plastic card in the same order that it is on the Knight Titan, so I can always keep everything straight as far as color balance and things like that. So now I'm going to kind of walk you through the various techniques, and I'm going to reference hobby cheating videos I used, because this piece was really the culmination of a lot of different techniques that I have deliberately practiced over multiple years, and I'm going to basically walk you through where I applied those techniques and reference the hobby cheating video itself, so you can go back and look at it. All the links to all the videos I referenced, by the way, will be in the description, so if you want to go back and look at all of those, you're more than welcome to. Hopefully this is at least instructive of the way that I break down and think about a miniature. So first off, we had the base color itself, and as always, we started with some zenithal highlighting. So everywhere where you see a sort of standard matte color of paint that isn't metallic, that's our zenithal highlighting and glazes, which was recently revisited in Hobby Cheating 75, as well as many others. I talk about zenithal highlighting a lot. There's also a warm zenithal highlighting that I used some of on this. I'll link that video down there as well. But all the reds were laid down in those kinds of tones. I did some panel modulation and things like that, but I didn't want to overexpress that, because there's a point where panel modulation can get a bit too extreme. So I wanted some fading, but I didn't want it to be over the top. When it comes to the freehand, obviously we have some non-metallic metal gold. This comes out of Hobby Cheating 69. I've used slightly different colors than what's in that video, but for this one. But that's because you slightly vary your gold tones depending on what you're trying to achieve and what you need to balance it against. The techniques that you see me apply in that video are exactly what I did here. And all of the freehand gold you see on the sky, from the fleur-de-lis and ring up top to the Aegis on the shoulder and everything else all over the model is all done in this same style and using those techniques. And I feel like there's also a color balance and composition. So I've got a hobby cheating on color balance and composition, and that's obviously in play here too, because if you look at this model, there is, obviously I tried to keep everything into a very warm tone when you look at the yellows and the reds, the warm white, etc., to be balanced against the cold steel, because steel always reads cold and somewhat blue-gray. Now, there is one very, very notable exception, and we'll talk about that in a little while. All right. So then, next up, we have to carve out all of our panel lines. So this is the black lining Hobby Cheating 56. This is often called pin washing when you're doing it with vehicles. But it is a critical step when you're doing large-scale vehicles that have panels, because you want those shadows to be properly recessed. And when you are airbrushing or painting with a brush, it doesn't really matter. You're going to tend to fill those little spaces with paint, and they shouldn't be the same color. When you look at these on a real vehicle, they tend to actually be in a fairly decent shadow, as also because, dust and grime and stuff will build up into them quite easily. So they tend to be dark. Now, in this case, I think we over-exaggerate them slightly on the miniatures, but it has a very nice visual aesthetic to it when you do so. Edge highlighting, of course. There's a lot of edge highlighting going on in this miniature, even though I tried to keep it somewhat subtle. If you look at the edges of her armor, there's some, but all the steel edges have a very subtle, true metallic metal edging. If you look at like his hand and his fingers, that's where it's kind of the most obvious. But all of the edging, I think, is incredibly important because it helps the steel gleam a little more, even as the model is turned. I don't know how this is going to be viewed, and at the moment when, say, a judge or a viewer is looking at it, so the edge highlights can help that pop some. And that's Hobby Cheating 125. Just recently revisited that one. Obviously on her, we've got a lot of blending going on because she has a classic Sisters sort of enameled armor. So wherever we're running from white to black, which is what her armor does, we have a lot of blending going on. So the techniques you see me use in Hobby Cheating 107 are what I applied to her armor. And, that's kind of a lot of the basic techniques. That's a lot of our big colors. That sort of charts out our colors, a lot of our panels, things like that. But of course, there's a lot more detail on this, and that's one of the take-homes, I think. When you're doing a competition piece, the way I think about it is you have to have a lot of stuff to discover. What I mean by that is when you do a competition piece, it has to have interesting things going on visually. Things for the judges to find as they look closely. Now, it has to have a pop to it. It has to have something that draws their attention, okay? Because you may be at a competition where there's several hundred entries, and there's only a few judges, and they're going to have to look at all of those, and they need to see your entry jump out at them. That can be something you do with composition or conversion. It can be things like freehand. It can be things like color placement. There's lots of different ways to grab attention. But once you've got it, you've got to give them more beyond that initial kick. So just doing something in some quite shocking colors to make it stand out, or doing something unusual compositionally, doesn't then get you sort of to the next level if that's where you're concerned to be getting. You have to then have lots of little things for them to find as they start looking deeper at your miniature. Okay, so on the next slide, we're going to talk a lot about all of the sort of detail elements that I put into this piece to hopefully make it visually interesting at different layers. So that brings us to the detail. So here we have a different angle on the piece. And obviously, as I mentioned, a lot of this was done in sub-assemblies. But a key thing to think about when it comes to a piece like this is that when you're trying to do a competition piece, you sort of can't paint anything on autopilot. And that's where we're going to talk about the detail. What I mean by autopilot is there are sort of techniques that we all have and we all build up for dealing with certain things. We encounter a skull or bone, we apply our skull or bone painting. And that's fine. You see leather, you apply your leather technique. Now, that may be right or it may be wrong. I don't know. But the point is that when you're doing an army, you use those heuristics to get the work done quickly and efficiently and create a look that you know is good. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. But when you're doing a piece for competition, you have to stop yourself from doing that. You need to look carefully at every piece, how it sits with everything else, and really consider what you're creating. What's going to be, every element of it needs to be sort of carefully thought about, in my experience and estimation. So every piece on here, from every rivet and streak and stain and rust bit and whatever it was, I really tried to think deeply about as to how I was applying my techniques, what needed to look where, and how. Because in the end, I wanted this piece to convey a certain theme, right? And the narrative of this piece, of the Sister of Battle and the Redemption Engine, was very important to me. I wanted it to be obvious to anybody what was going on. And so the whole paint job, everything that you build, needs to work toward that. So let's talk about some of the detail techniques now. First off, we've got heated metal on the gun. Obviously, we've got a big Gatling gun, so that's Hobby Cheating 57. And that's how we do sort of a burn effect where the barrel gets repeatedly heated up. This is a Sister of Battle. Her gun didn't just come off the assembly line, right? The rest of the model has damage and bullet scrapes and little bits of rust streaks and things like that. So hence the gun needs to look well worn and well used as well. In my mind, this was sort of a reconstituted Titan. This is something that was probably rescued from the battlefield by the Inquisition and reformatted and given to this sister who had, this canoness or whatever, who had earned her redemption. Next up, the true metallic metal shading in a non-metallic metal style. This is something I have a lot of videos about. Here specifically is 79 is the video that most closely resembles what I'm doing here. But this is very important to me. I think a lot of people apply metals and then they'll do things like throw a wash on or something like that, which doesn't make sense to me. Metal has an incredible natural sheen and luster if you're using a good metal paint. And in my mind, the worst thing you can do is then dull the whole thing out with a wash that immediately kills the shine and coffee stains it and all sorts of other bad things. What I prefer with it is to create the same variance in the true metallic metal that I have in my non-metallic metal. So if you look at the metal in the Titan's legs, like on the interior of the legs, especially like look under the right knee, you'll see how dark that gold gets in there compared to the sort of silver reflection. That's not just the light falling where it is. That's me purposely shading it and highlighting it with, infusions of silver paint, etc., to increase the reflectiveness. Now, one of the reasons that I felt like this is a big deal in this piece is because I'm using non-metallic metal painting in the freehand and real metal on what is the real metal. So if the real metal was flat and uninteresting, and the non-metallic metal had this big color transition from bright to dark, your brain is going to look at that and kind of rebel and be like, wait, what? How is the real metal the dull and interesting thing? That doesn't work. So hence why it was critical for me to make sure that we had a lot of variation and interesting sort of traveling of the tones, just as though we were doing the whole thing in NMM. All right, this one you can look at me actually doing this particular piece. This is applying and painting decals, Hobby Cheating 119. I recorded this while I was working on that particular piece right there. But a few of the freehand pieces in here have decals or decals underneath them. Got a lot of heat for calling them decals, but that's just the way I've always said it. But I'll say decals so nobody gets angry at me. Like the little skulls you see there, the leaves that are on the shield. There's a few others. Most of this isn't underpinned by that, but it's a good technique for doing especially smaller freehand elements and getting yourself something down to basically sketch over. It's one of my sort of favorite tricks when it comes to making sure you get a nice, clean, even, balanced freehand, is you can start with the decal as sort of your baselines, and then you just fill and paint the whole thing. So there's a few elements of that scattered around here. Next up, we've got Rust and Battle Damage, which is Hobby Cheating 90, which you can see me do. I'm working on a similar Titan, a Titan I did last year, not the same Titan, but you'll see it applied to a Knight Titan. So, Rust and Battle Damage is something very important to me, especially on a vehicle. Vehicles don't self-repair. Most people, most military organizations will take extreme care of vehicles to prevent rust. So the modern military works really hard to make sure that vehicles are properly upkept and protected, so that because rust is real bad on, working pieces of military equipment. However, this is the grimdark and in the far future of the 41st century where all there is war. Well, my guess is things aren't quite as properly upkept as they should be. Campaigns get long, battles get back to back to back, and there's not always time to care for things as cleanly and properly and completely as one might want. So I wanted this piece to look like it had seen battle. This is a sister who has sought after redemption and now seeks to prove worthy of what the Emperor has, bestowed upon her here. So hence it was important to show that this thing had been used. It didn't just roll off the factory line, right? So hence the scrapes and cuts in the armor and the enamel. And you'll see some of it goes onto the frame as well. Some of it's in the true metallic metal in there as well. And the goal with that is it needs to look uniform. You can't people don't just shoot you in your armor. Would I guess be the take home there, unfortunately. So I wanted to make sure that the entire piece had that same amount of sort of weathering and damage to it. Not heavy. This isn't an orcish vehicle that they've never even thought about taking it to a mechanic. But it had to be something that looked like it had seen a fair amount of work. Bone. Obviously, we've got the big skull, and other skulls scattered all around here. So we've got Bone, Hobby Cheating 29. Still basically the technique I used here. Instead of just the orange, I also infused a little red to mix with the sort of sandy, Martian-esque landscape that this thing is walking across. That pigment that's down there in the dirt is also up on the skull, because it would be. So all the skulls have some of that pigment drawn up into them. If they're sitting here in this dust and dirt and debris, they're going to get colorized in that way. But the techniques I lay out in that one are still the same. You can also see that there are cracks and scratches in the bone, so it's not just painting the bone. Again, really thinking about every element of this. She's putting the weight of this massive machine of war onto this skull. Now, I assume that's the skull of like some Tyranid or some alien creature that's probably super strong, but that is a multi-ton machine. And so you can see where it's actually cracking under the weight of the foot. Again, if we want to sell the narrative, it's got to be complete, right? We've got to hit all of our different elements. In the same way, we've got pigment from Hobby Cheating 109. If this big machine is walking through this dusty, dry wasteland battlefield landscape, it's going to obviously have some pigment on its feet. Now, this machine is probably walking somewhat quickly, so it's not as though it's walking through a dust storm. You could certainly go that direction. You can push this to differing degrees. Here I wanted to keep it minimal-ish. Basically, where the feet would have been buried and the pigment would have been left behind is what I wanted to bring up into the miniature. There's also other pigment used throughout this thing in quite a few places. So the gun barrel has black pigment. Gun barrels have some black pigment on the end of them. The smokestack uses black pigment quite heavily. Those kinds of things. Okay, over here we've got weathered concrete, which is Hobby Cheating 121. Again, you can see me make this exact piece. When I was working on the base for this, I recorded that, so you can see how I do old weathered concrete. I really like concrete in general, like painting it. I think it's fun. You get to do crazy stippling and stuff like that. But again, the same pigment that's on the dirt is also drawn into the concrete. It's drawn into the metal and the rust and the feet to tie everything together. If the mini lives in this environment for any amount of time, unless she just drop potted in or something, right? Whatever. I know you can't put a night titan on a drop pod, but unless she just made, Planet Landing or whatever, then everything here should have the same pigment on it and be drawn together. The skulls, the stone, the metal, the miniature, tie that all together to make it look like it's holistically part of that environment. Freehand, going all the way back to Hobby Cheating 18. That's a little bit more about simple freehand. This is obviously a little bit more detailed than that, but the same principles are still in effect. I just kept painting. So instead of stopping with something simple, I just kept shading and painting, the skull until I got to something that looked more detailed. And that is really one of those things that just kind of comes with practice over time. You can evolve your simple freehand once you've got down the basics into more complex images. It's still something I struggle with every miniature, every time. It is something that I marvel at others who do incredible freehand. I'm proud enough of what I've managed to achieve, I suppose. I'm happy but not satisfied, as I always say. There are those out there who do freehand, Sam Lenz and Richard Gray and people who do freehand that just blows my mind. But nonetheless, the same principles are here. And to me, this is one of those things that needed to be on every part of this miniature. This is the Sisters of Battle being part of the Ecclesiastes, however you say it, and being a very religious order. I grew up Catholic, and I know that they love over-detailed, very bespoke everything. Like, everything is ornate. So I felt like the Titan needed to have a similar level of attention being part of a religious order. So every panel had to have freehand that spoke to its purpose, right? So there isn't a blank panel on here because they would have wanted to cover everything with their iconography. That's what's in my head. Part of that freehand being scroll work, which I have a specific Hobby Cheating dedicated just to scroll work, and there's quite a bit of it on here. I call it out there on the knee, but as you can see, it's also on the actual scrolls, both real and freehanded. So, for example, on the sort of underplate of the chest, there's a scroll. On the top of the little armor plate, there's a scroll. But then the one on the hand, on the left hand, that's obviously just painted on. There is no base scroll there, but that's just added because I wanted to have, again, all of this feel ornate and like it has an importance to it, a reverence to this machine. Power swords. So this uses the same technique out of my power swords video. This is Hobby Cheating 70. And I want to also take a moment here to talk about composition. So I talked a little earlier about the nature of the color scheme of this, and I wanted to make sure everything was in balance. One thing that I realized as I started putting the whole piece together was that it was going to be, because of this freehand everywhere and the super bright metal and the big white flaming-eyed skull on the top of the thing, is that the sister was getting lost. And by that, what I mean is she's a rather small component of this big giant machine, but she's the center, right? In this miniature, she's its face. We always talk about how you sort of want to over-highlight and over-exaggerate the light on faces to draw attention. For this miniature, she's the face. And so I decided to go with the blue power sword, not just because it's the traditional color for power swords, but also because it does purposefully break the rules of color balance. If I was using that bright blue, I should technically have that in other places to balance that color out, but I didn't. And that was an intentional choice because I wanted to snap your eye to her. In the end, I felt there was enough other things that were visually interesting between the big skulls, the bright gold that's extremely reflective on the top carapace, that your eye would still be able to move around. It wouldn't completely trap it, but it would draw your attention. Now, there's hints of blue in her armor and in some of the tubes. So I did still use hints of this blue throughout in some other places. If you look carefully, you'll see like little tubes or where there's rubber in the legs. Some of that uses it. Again, just to subtly work the color throughout. But the only place it's that bright is that sword. And that's to hopefully draw your attention so you notice that she's in the middle. Because sort of my nightmare situation was people looked at the Titan and thought it was just a normal Titan and didn't realize, you know, what the narrative that was going on here. So I had to adjust and bring that sword there. And finally, of course, one of the most critical elements throughout this whole thing is using oil washes. This is Hobby Cheating 89. All of the metal on this, the steel metal, I should say, as well as a lot of the weathering was done through oil washes and oil paints. I love using oils on miniatures. It means that you have to really think about how you layer this stuff up, because you have to have a very particular pattern to how you go from your base color to your pins to your highlights to your freehand and then your oil washes and so on and so forth, so you can varnish in between layers and give it enough time. But sort of once you kind of have your order down, it's just an unbelievably useful tool. It adds a wonderful sheen to the metal without destroying its natural metallic shine. It has this really, really organic sort of texture, I guess is what I would say, it gives the metal. It's one of my favorite sort of effects, and anytime I can bring in oil paints, especially like oil washes and oil streaking and stuff onto miniatures, I love to do it. It's one of the reasons I love big vehicles, because I get to play with oil paints a whole bunch. So, there you go. That's kind of all of it. I mean, there's certainly more. There's probably more techniques. I went through my entire, hobby cheating playlist up to this point to think about the various elements that I'd used. I'm sure there's more at play that I didn't think about. There's certainly more techniques that I was applying here. For example, the little liquid bottles, of how you make liquid look like something look like it's full of liquid, because all the guns and swords have those sort of liquid tanks in them. I tagged that for a future video. Doing flowers and vines, painting, more complicated freehand scenes with backgrounds like I did on the left shoulder. So things like that. Those are probably some future videos as well. I saw this piece as a real challenge to myself, a sort of culmination of a lot of different techniques together that I had been working on and deliberately practicing on. I really didn't want to do this to just say, oh, look at this thing I did. That's not the goal of this. I really hope it doesn't come off like that. I really hesitated to do this video for this reason, because it seems like super braggadocious, and that's not my intention. There are so many people doing so much better work than me in the world, and I'm just trying to improve myself and take my own next step. But I've had a lot of questions come to me of how I think about creating my competition pieces and how I go through them and the steps and techniques I use. So I thought actually breaking it down and showing you the various tutorials that I've created in the past and then applied those techniques on this piece would hopefully be helpful or instructive. I certainly hope that it's what it is. That's the goal of this. That's the idea. So I hope you found it helpful. As I said, all the links to all the videos I've mentioned are down in the comments. So if you want to go watch any of those, put those together in your own projects, that's certainly there. As I mentioned, this piece is up now for voting in the sort of finals of Crystal Brush, so you understand how Crystal Brush works. 50% of the vote or 50% of your score is determined by the vote of users, of viewers who vote on the Crystal Brush website. So I'll link that down below. The other 50% is the judges' votes, by the way. So go check that out. You vote if you want to vote for my piece or my pieces. I would be incredibly honored to have you vote for them. But there's a lot of amazing entries this year. I would highly recommend you go hit the link just to check it out and give some votes. So many people have done just stunningly gorgeous work. It's an absolute inspiration to me, and one of the main reasons that I compete is to see everybody else's work. All I think when I look at competitions is, oh my gosh, that's incredible too. And so I love seeing the work from everyone. I hope you do too. I hope you find it inspirational. I know nothing pushes me to get better like looking at other artists that I admire do incredible work, and there's so many out there doing work, and Crystal Brush is a great chance where one of the few times where you see both the European and the US painters putting their best foot forward. So check it out. Links down below, as are all the links to the videos. But I appreciate you watching this. I hope it was helpful and instructive to see my thought processes and techniques that I use. If you liked it, give it a like. If you want to see more hobby cheating in the future, we'll be returning to techniques next week. But don't forget to subscribe for more videos. Share this with anybody if you feel that they would want to watch it. Sharing is always the nicest thing you can do and deeply appreciated. If you have any other questions on the piece, don't be afraid to drop them down there. But as always, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.